Hi everyone, so to take a break from tiering exotic armor, exotic weapons, legendary weapons, and before we move on to primaries, I wanted to take a brief moment to create a sort of entertainment focused tier list rather than an informative one, where I talk about my perspective as a speedrunner on raid encounters, since I primarily speedrun raids and not, dungeons or levels or strikes, etc, etc. So I came up with a list of factors to actually rank and rate every single raid encounter, and these factors are the 5 things that I think speedrunners care the most about when it comes to analyzing whether a raid encounter is fun or good to speedrun. So what are these factors? Well, number 1, we have strats. So that is, what is the difference between the intended Bungie way of doing an encounter, or maybe even the LFG way of doing an encounter, if we're considering stuff like Riven cheese, versus how people do it in a speedrun versus the speedrun strat. So how unique is the speedrun strat? How different is the speedrun strat? That's number 1. Number 2, we have gating. And gating means how long are you waiting there during a speedrun doing nothing, right? Or how long are you forced to kind of wait through a segment that always takes the same amount of time? AKA, how much control do you have over the speed of the raid during this encounter? And maybe there are sections where a boss is doing a certain animation where you can't really do anything to speed up the encounter, you're kind of just sitting there. That's what gating is. And number 3, we have depth. So depth means how intricately can you plan around an encounter, and how much does that encounter actually reward you for being very practiced, very experienced in the encounter itself. So to give you a more direct example, Shuro Chi is an encounter that speedrunners and speedrun teams spend a very, very long time mastering and perfecting because it has a lot of quirks, and the entire encounter is basically very, very detailed, has some very detailed strats, and you have to work on it as a team for a very long time. But at the end of those, maybe days, even weeks of practice, you see some very good results, and that will separate you from a team that has not practiced as much. So how hard is the strat to master, and how much does that mastery actually pay off? What does a practice yield? Okay, and then 4th, we have the fun factor. So the fun factor, there are some raid encounters and raids in general that are notorious in speedrunning for having half the team do very boring roles, very, almost meaningless roles, and while the other half gets to do fun stuff, or even some encounters where everybody's doing something boring. So obviously, speedrunning is about having fun to some extent, and even the act of speedrunning itself is pretty fun. So I have to include this as one of the factors, and punish some encounters where maybe the encounter itself is unique and the strategy is unique, but half the team is doing a rather, boring job, and the other half is doing a more fun job. That I'm obviously going to have to dock some points for that as well. And then finally, we have the last factor, which I suppose is kind of related to the previous one, and that is RNG. So when you actually get into runs, there's a lot of things in raid encounters in Destiny that are random to some extent. You might have a boss that, takes a random amount of time to go into final stand, or you might have some sort of timer that has a random duration assigned to it that you cannot control. Now, not all of these factors do actually play into a speedrun. Some of them can be bypassed, some of them can be ignored, and some things like, for example, the Harpy boss in Garden, you're not actually gated to the speed of that encounter, so the RNG of where the Harpy moves from to get to the relay, whether it's a long time or a short time, doesn't actually end up mattering. I'm talking about RNG that actually affects the time of the run and is annoying and cannot be bypassed or dealt with easily. So an example of this, I know all of you who have done King's Fall know that Oryx can either pick a top plate or a bottom plate to slam his fist on. If you have the misfortune in a speedrun at the very end of a great King's Fall speedrun and Oryx chooses a bottom plate, you will automatically be subject to 5 to 10 seconds of time loss for no reason, and there's nothing you can do to play around it or control it. So because of that, RNG is also a factor that I considered when it comes to ranking these raid encounters. So with all those factors in mind, let's move on and talk about all of the raid encounters in Destiny 2, including some entrances that I thought were substantial, and minus all of the sunset raids, so only the 8 raids that are currently in the game right now, from Last Wish all the way up to the recently released Crota's End. Let's start with the oldest encounter in current Destiny 2, Kalli. Kalli, the first encounter in Last Wish, is done pretty similarly in speedrunning compared to how you would do it in an LFG, but compared to Bungie's intended way of capturing all the plates then doing damage in the middle, most people who do the raid these days, including speedrunners, trap Kalli by applying a damage over time effect to her while she's deciding the first plate that she wants to teleport to. Besides this, someone is skipping to Shuro Chi out of bounds during Kalli, so you're doing a 5-man kill, and in speedrunning the kill is a lot more optimized, a lot faster using Hunters on Golden Gun and Izanagi's Burden compared to something like an LFG strat where you might see linears. Besides that, Kalli is pretty similar to LFGs. It's not that different in strategy. So that being said, I gave Kalli a 1 for strats. In terms of gating, you're not really waiting for much besides for her to teleport to mid, so I gave it the max points of 3. For depth, I gave Kalli a 0 because there's not much you can do to really get much elsewhere in Kalli once you first started practicing the correct strategy. In terms of fun, I gave it a 1 out of 3 because Kalli does not really have anyone doing a particularly interesting role, it's just damage. And finally for RNG, I gave Kalli a 0. There shouldn't really be any factors that you can't control when it comes to the speed of the Kalli encounter. So with that being said, as a wrap-up, Kalli gets a score of 5 total points, which puts it solidly in the D tier. Shuro Chi is the second encounter of Last Wish following from Kalli, which everyone is pulled from by the skipper. Now there's a couple crazy strats used in this encounter that are very far removed from what Bungie intended players to do, like for example, getting Az to spawn early by having Shuro boop you off a plate as you are lowering her shield, or pre-plating the puzzle and having it automatically complete without anyone actually being present while the puzzle is active. So with that being said, I'm going to give Shuro Chi a 3 out of 3 for its crazy unique strats. I'm going to give it a 3 out of 3 for gating because the encounter, flows very smoothly. Players are barely ever have any downtime. I'm going to give it a 3 out of 3 for depth because it takes a lot of practice to really get this encounter down right for speedrunning teams. I'm going to give it a 3 out of 3 for the fun factor because everybody is practically involved in almost all aspects of the encounter, whether you're pre-plating, whether you're doing damage, ad clearing, moving, skipping floors. There's plenty of things, plenty of roles that need to be filled in this encounter. And finally, I'm going to give Shuro a 0 for RNG. Now that early crystals has been figured out on final floor, that was kind of the last missing piece. So with that being said, Shuro Chi gets a perfect score of 12 out of 12 points, and that's going to land it solidly in the S tier. Next up on our Last Wish encounter list, we have Morgeth. Now, Morgeth is typically seen as a very uninteresting encounter when it comes to Last Wish, but there is something unique about it in speedrunning, and that is that there's actually a skip from Morgeth to Vault. And since Vault requires 3 people to be on the plates to start the encounter, we actually have 3 people skip, meaning that you do Morgeth as a trio. Now, the 3 people that stay behind in Morgeth, the strategy for trioing Morgeth is actually not particularly interesting. It's almost identical to 6-man, except you pick up less strengths. And the only issue really is damage. And your damage slows down a little bit compared to 6-man because obviously you have half the players, but his health isn't very high, so even this is not that hard of an execution when it comes to doing the encounter with less people than normal. So with that being said, I'm going to give Morgeth a 2 out of 3 for strats because it's not as intricate as something like Shuro or some of the other 3-rated encounters you're going to see in the future. And I'm also going to give it a 2 out of 3 for gating, mostly because Morgeth is an encounter where you're not actually spending that much time doing much because you're only really gated to the ads that spawn at the beginning as well as the captains that spawn at the end. And so the pressure in terms of player actions, player gating, ad gating is not as high as some of the other encounters on this list like Shuro Chi. On top of that, I'm going to give Morgeth a 1 out of 3 for depth. You really don't need to practice this encounter much besides getting your Morgeth skip as consistent as possible to get to Vault consistently in full runs. Finally, I'm going to give Morgeth a -2. I'm going to give it a -2. I'm going to dock 2 points from it for RNG, mostly because Morgeth skip is easily considered the most annoying skip in the game, and the fact that you have to have 3 people hit it consistently if you want to do full runs is very, very annoying. Definitely the most annoying reset point when it comes to skips in any raid. So with that being said, Morgeth racks up a total of 5 points, which is going to land it in the D tier with Kalli. After Morgeth dies, the 3 warlocks on skip pull everybody to the Vault encounter. Now strategy-wise, this encounter is not as complex as you might think. Obviously, the ad clear is more optimized, and so is the routing and reading, but the main difference between Bungie's intended ways and speedrunning strategies are the fact that on the 3rd captain of every round, the one that matters, the one that ends the round by dunking, that one is actually booped out of its room using tractor cannon from an underlight player, and that captain is then killed. The eye is picked up by a warlock on Astrocyte Verse, and they blink through the wall before it actually fully forms so that they can get into the center chamber and dunk without going through a side tunnel. Now that's a pretty unique strat, so I'm going to go ahead and give Vault a 2 out of 3 for strats. I'm not going to give it a full 3 because, besides that, the encounter is done largely normally. I'm going to give it a 2 out of 3 for gating because between rounds and while you're waiting for your room to open, there is some downtime. I'm going to give it a 2 out of 3 for depth because you do need to practice this encounter, but it's nowhere near as meticulous as something like Shuro Chi. I'm going to give it a 2 out of 3 on the fun factor because there are some roles that are largely relegated to ad clear or kind of waiting around while you're, waiting to have someone else boop. There is some downtime there. And I'm going to give it a -1, or I'm going to dock it 1 point. On RNG, and that's because on the final captain of every round, if it's stair, you are guaranteed to have to cover a longer distance, and if it's rock, you can have some silly captain spawn locations that can ruin otherwise a potentially good boop. So with that being said, Vault amasses a total of 7 points, which puts it solidly in the B tier. Next up, we have the last boss encounter of Last Wish, and that is Riven of 1,000 Voices. So Riven is actually pretty basic. There are 2 people that leave the end of Vault encounter early to get on Riven plates and do the transition by themselves. One of them will drop down and send, and the other person will drop down and help with the damage side, no matter what the RNG is. Now, sending, I suppose, you could do with Izanagi's Burden, but that's technically in line with what Bungie intended. The only difference between what Bungie intended and what players actually do in speedruns is, I guess, the Riven cheese, which I'm not really going to give much points for because LFGs do that all the time now. It's kind of the assumed strategy when you're going on a Last Wish run in most groups. And besides that, I suppose there's a Hunter that Lumina grapples to the top of the Ascendant plane after damage is done. Damage is a little bit more optimized. You don't use swords on Riven in speedrunning, you use Surrounded Apex Predator. But besides that, there's not much. I mean, you try to do Final Stand quickly. It's mostly just damage changes, really. So in terms of strategy, I'm going to give Riven a 1 out of 3 because it is slightly different than how you would do it in maybe like an LFG or Bungie's intended way, because you have people skip to Riven and start at duo, and you have someone send and everyone else does damage, which is not something you're really even going to do in an LFG. You're not going to run that risk of losing one person for damage. I'm going to give Riven a 2 out of 3 for gating because there's not much waiting, but Riven's opening cutscene is kind of long. But besides that, there's not too much, and you have to wait for her to like go through the wall and be sent. There's also, I'm going to give Riven a 0 out of 3 for depth because there's almost nothing that you need to practice as a speedrunning team. As long as you know the strategy, you're kind of just going to kill the boss every time. I'm going to give Riven a 1 out of 3 for fun factor because everybody is just doing damage for the most part in this encounter. And, it's not boring damage, I guess, but it's not particularly interesting either. There's one person that Lumina grapples and one person that sends, neither of which are crazy hard or interesting rolls. I'm also going to give Riven a 0 for RNG because as far as I'm concerned, neither send is particularly slower than the other, and there's not much RNG in the encounter besides that. So with that being said, Riven is going to get 4 points out of a possible 12, and that's going to put Riven solidly in the D tier for speedrunning. After slaying Riven, there's only one encounter left in Last Wish, and that is Queenswalk, a famously beloved encounter in speedrunning thanks to its emphasis on movement and lack of gating. Strategy-wise, there's only 2 strategies that differ from how Bungie intended players to do this encounter. Number 1, using eager-edged swords to launch the player with the heart on a precise path that is short as possible to get to the end of Queenswalk. The second is a strategy called Vault Skip, where a player on a movement subclass like Strand Hunter might grapple over the wall separating the center chamber of the Vault encounter from the stair room in order to pick up the heart through the wall from a previous carrier. This allows them to skip a majority of the end section of Queenswalk where one must traverse the tunnels separating the vault rooms. As a result, I'm going to go ahead and give Queenswalk a 2 out of 3 points for strats. I'm going to give it a 3 out of 3 for gating, as there's practically no gating in this encounter. I'm going to give it a 2 out of 3 for depth, because while you do need to practice the movement and lining in this encounter, there's not much intricacy and depth to it. And I'm going to also give Queenswalk a 2 out of 3 for the fun factor, because most of the people in the team are involved in lining players and could be chosen for skip or for carrying the heart, etc. The only player that really isn't doing anything is the player on the galley roll that kills the ads at the start and then dies and doesn't participate in the encounter, so I decided to dock a point for that. Finally, Queenswalk has a little bit of RNG. Anytime you're hitting someone else with an eager-edged sword, there's a chance that the game just phases you right through them, and this is slightly connection-based and can be accounted for, but it is still a small element of RNG at the end of a very long run. So I'm going to go ahead and dock 1 point for RNG, which leads us to a total of 8 points for Queenswalk, and that leaves it solidly in the A tier. Let's talk about Garden of Salvation next. Now, the first encounter of this raid, which I'll call Evade, has a unique strategy that I'm sure you've never seen before. This strategy is called room skipping, and it allows you to skip major portions of the encounter by linking 6 people in a tether instead of 3, and chaining from a previous room's tether box and reusing it for a future room's tether lock. Now, that being said, the rest of this encounter is actually quite simple. It just has more optimized ad clears and skip to the second encounter. Now, In terms of points, I'm going to go ahead and give Evade a 2 out of 3 for strats, because that strategy of room skipping is very unique, but doesn't have anywhere near the same amount of intricacy as something like Shuro Chi or some of the other 3 rated encounters, which I'll talk about in the future. As for gating, I'm going to give it a 2 out of 3 because the flower field section cannot be sped up at all, and it's, quite a long section of the encounter. I'm going to give Evade a 2 out of 3 for depth because you do need to practice the ad clear, but it's not as precise as some of the more taxing and practice-focused encounters in Destiny 2 raid speedrunning. Finally, I'm going to give it a 3 out of 3 for fun factor because everybody is moving and constantly contributing to the encounter at this point. And I'm also going to give it a -2 for RNG. Now, you might be wondering, why am I taking the maximum amount of points off of this encounter? Well, that's because, unfortunately, if you want to do the room skip strategy, only certain tether boxes are long enough, a short enough distance from the future room's tether locks so that you can actually do the 6-man tether and do the room skip. So you're going to be running into a lot of RNG, essentially a actually 1 in 3 chance that you have a run that can proceed past first encounter. So with that being said, I'm going to give Evade a total of 7 points, which places it solidly in the B tier. Next up, we have Garden of Salvation's second encounter, or Summon. Now, this encounter has some crazy unique strats that I'm not going to explain in detail right now because that would take too much time, but in the future, just know that I will be going over every single raid's optimal strategies in speedrunning and explaining how they work at a layman kind of level. But for now, just know that I'm going to give this encounter a 3 out of 3 for its early mid, 0 sub, and Anarchy sub strategies. There's plenty of strategies that go into this encounter, so I think it deserves a 3 out of 3 for points. In terms of gating, I gave it a 2 out of 3 because you do have to wait between some sides. There is that 15-second period where you are really doing nothing and you can't really contribute to speeding up the encounter at any moment during that time. I'm also going to give Garden of Salvation's second encounter a 3 out of 3 for depth because you do have to practice this encounter a lot. It is among the most practiced encounters in Destiny 2 when it comes to raid speedrunning. I'm also going to give it a 3 out of 3 for the fun factor because I believe every single role is doing something semi-major to contribute to the rest of the encounter, and none of the roles are really particularly boring, whether it's setting up 0 sub or doing the actual ad clear during the subs themselves. Finally, I'm also going to give Garden of Salvation's second encounter a 0 for RNG because I don't believe there's any major RNG. If you plan around the final subs of your encounter correctly, it doesn't really matter what plate gets Angelics last, and so yeah, I'm going to give it 0 points off for RNG. Finally, the score of this entire encounter is going to be 11 points, which puts it solidly in the S tier, right behind the 2 encounters that have 12 points. Now, if you're familiar with Garden of Salvation speedrunning at all, you will know that there is a new strategy that's been employed over this past year in the raid, where you can do both the 3rd and 4th encounter simultaneously, which is really crazy, not something that we see in literally any other raid currently in Destiny 2. So without a doubt, I'm going to give a 3 out of 3 for the strategy section for both Consecrated and Sanctified Mind, but let's talk about the other categories of points. For gating, I'm going to go ahead and give Harpy a 2 out of 3, mostly because there is a short time during the encounter where you're kind of just waiting for the Harpy to swim over to the relay so you can start shooting its eyes and doing damage. That relay you can't control. I'm also going to give it a 1 out of 3 for depth. Now, this might be a little bit controversial, but I believe that Trio Harpy is pretty easy, and you're not gated to Trio Harpy either in terms of the encounter. Sanctified always finishes slower, it's a slower encounter. So in terms of practice, you don't need to be super perfect, you just gotta make sure you're killing the boss consistently and doing it within picking up 1 spit. In terms of the fun factor, I'm going to give it a 2 out of 3, mostly because there is one role that gets to the relay early and kind of sits there and just waits for the team and doesn't do much besides that, while the other 2 roles are largely focused on progressing the encounter's mechanics and getting motes fast. Finally, I'm going to give Harpy a 0 for RNG. In previous years of Garden speedrunning, you would definitely see a -2 here because where the Harpy is drastically affects how fast he gets to the relay and how fast you can progress to Sanctified. Now that you're actually gated to Sanctified finishing and not Harpy finishing, it doesn't matter where he is, so I'm not going to dock points from Harpy for that RNG. So this is going to give Harpy a total of 8 points, which lands it solidly in the A tier, and we'll move on to Sanctified Mind. Well, what about Sanctified Mind? Well, in my opinion, compared to Harpy, this encounter is actually a fair amount less complex and less tight when it comes to time. Well, I did say Sanctified is the slower encounter and is technically the gate of the raid. Once second mid-sub is over and second encounter finishes, it's still actually a lot less difficult to execute the strategies in Sanctified Mind. Well, why is that? Well, first of all, I'm going to go out and say Sanctified does get a 3 out of 3 for strats because it is part of that 3-3 strat that I mentioned earlier. It definitely deserves 3 out of 3 for that. But when it comes to gating, Sanctified is actually gated largely to the portals that pull people in and out of the places where you get motes. And unfortunately, you can't really speed up how quickly you can pull someone from a portal. It's just gated to a certain number of seconds. And unfortunately, that means that the skill ceiling of the encounter is drastically lowered, and the only thing you can really speed up is the kill section of the encounter. So I'm going to give it a 1 out of 3 for gating. I give it a 1 out of 3 for depth for similar reasons. I'm going to give it a 2 out of 3 for fun because I believe the rules are a little less interesting than Harpy. And I also gave it a 0 out of 3 for RNG because ground motes aren't a problem when you get a fresh set of ads every single time someone goes in a portal and you're doing 3 portals on each side. So with that being said, Sanctified gets a 7-point total on its scoring, and that's going to give it a B tier rating. Next up, we have our first raid in which I'm considering the entrance to be an encounter, and that is, of course, Deepstone Crypt. So Desolation, the entrance encounter, has some pretty unique strategies where hunters will go out of bounds to reach the security encounter quickly. That being said, most of the hunters on entrance will be doing something called slipskating, and this is one of the only raid encounters or raid speedruns where Sparrow Tech, and using very fast Sparrow Tech specifically, is actually applicable to the speedrun. So I'm going to go ahead and give Desolation a 2 out of 3 for strategies, and it is pretty much just a movement or traversal encounter, so it's nothing like an actual encounter like Bridge or Shuro Chi, but you know, the strategies are cool enough that they warrant being separated from being barely above LFG, which is what I would call a 1-point encounter. Now I'm also going to give Desolation a 3 out of 3 for gating because you're not really gated to anything but the players getting to Crypt Security. I'm going to give Desolation a 1 out of 3 for depth because it's just a movement encounter. You're just doing the same path every time. Nothing changes, so it's not particularly deep to practice. I'm going to give it a 1 out of 3 for the fun factor, and that's mostly because half the fire team literally just leaves and rejoins during this encounter and does nothing. So while the other 3 are having fun, half the team is not really doing anything. I'm also going to give Desolation a 0 for RNG, and that's because there isn't really any RNG in an encounter where you're just going through a blizzard and making it to Crypt Security. So, with that being said, Desolation gets a total of 7 points, which puts it right at the same level as Sanctified Mind, which is a B tier encounter. After we make our way through the blizzard, we find ourselves at the Crypt Security encounter. Now, this encounter is kind of done half-half, much like Entrance. Half the team is kind of just there to do damage with 4th Horseman and Wardcliff Coil, while the other half of the team is doing more special mechanics like, for example, picking up Scanner through the floor and calling the fuses and buttons from out of bounds. Now, that's pretty unique, but there's also 2 players who don't participate in the encounter's actual shooting and do an early transition to get the Atraks while everybody else rejoins the fire team, which is also a pretty unique skip. It's an early transition, which is not something you typically see in Destiny 2 raid speedrunning. So strategy-wise, I'm going to give Crypt Security a 2 out of 3 for that half-half kind of deal. I'm also going to give it a 3 out of 3 for gating because you're entirely gated to callouts and shooting of buttons, shooting of fuses here. There's no time gating or waiting around for anything of that sort. I'm also going to give Crypt Security a 1 out of 3 for depth, mostly because there are a couple roles that need some practice when it comes to routing and lineups, but besides that, it's really just about shooting the buttons and shooting the fuses quickly, and getting good RNG on the buttons, which I'll discuss in a second. I'm going to give Crypt Security another 1 out of 3 just like Entrance because half the team is basically just there for the participation trophy, just to shoot the fuses and then leave the fire team. Finally, I'm going to give Crypt Security a -2 for RNG, because if you're running for really good DSC time, you are going to need specific buttons that are close to where the operator chooses to stand, and buttons like Dark 1 and 2 take a really long time to shoot, no matter what you choose to do. So, that being said, Crypt Security gets a total of 5 points, which is going to put it solidly in the D tier. After Crypt Security and a little bit of a cutscene, you reach Atraks. Now, Atraks is a little bit different from the other 2 encounters I just described from Deepstone Crypt. There's more team involvement, but the actual strats that everybody is using are a little bit dialed back. So strategy-wise, Atraks is literally just wait through the cutscene, place the flags, and then you're going to go and spread out and do ad clear on both floors as quickly as you can to spawn in the servitors. You nuke all the servitors, and then the 3 people upstairs just T-crash the boss with some horsemen or some parasite, and that's pretty much it. And then you wait for final stand. So strategy-wise, I'm going to go ahead and give Atraks a 1 out of 3 because there's barely any difference between LFG/intended strategies and Atraks done in speedrunning, outside of the fact that in speedrunning there is an airlock CP hitter who does not participate in the encounter past the 1st floor, and there is someone who is on skip to pull to the 3rd encounter of DSC. So 1 out of 3, kind of fair. For gating, I'm going to give Atraks a 2 out of 3. I subtracted 1 point because you have to wait for final stand, as well as that opening cutscene. For depth, I gave it a 1 out of 3, and that's because Atraks doesn't require that much practice. It's really just everybody getting their individual ad cleared down, and then, you know, kind of T-crashing the boss after calling out with Scanner, which is not super complicated. Finally, for the fun factor, I gave Atraks a 2 out of 3 because the ad clear is relatively brisk, and in terms of T-crashing the boss, you know, it's more fun than just kind of sitting there doing nothing, so I would say it's deserving more than a 1 out of 3. And finally, for RNG, there is some RNG in Atraks, but it's relatively minimal and not something that I would consider to be supremely significant or worth docking a point from the encounter. So with that being said, Atraks ranks up a total of 6 points, which puts it in the C tier. If there were a list of speedrunning encounters that need to be perfected as a team and really practice to get down right, Descent would definitely be on that list. Now, you might think Descent is not that complicated, right? You just clear ads, you know, you pick up augments, you know, you trade the augments when you get deactivated, you pick up cores, you dunk the cores, but Descent's a very sensitive encounter to ad leaks, and it can be difficult, it can be a challenge to keep your door trapped while also manipulating cores and dealing with all of these things that I just mentioned. So, Descent, I'm going to go ahead and give it a 2 out of 3 for strats because of cool stuff like blink suppressing as well as the floater system, which is more complex than what you might run into in an LFG or Bungie's sort of intended way of doing the encounter, which is sort of chaos mode. I'm also going to give Descent a 2 out of 3 for gating because you do have to wait a certain amount of time between core spawns even if your ad clear is really good. I'm also going to give it a 3 out of 3 for depth, and that's because this encounter does take a lot of practice, like I mentioned, to get down as a team, down to a certain target time for viable speedrunning. I'm also going to give Descent a 2 out of 3 for the fun factor, and that's because certain roles do have a fair amount of downtime like outer left, but it's not that big of a deal, and most people are, you know, they kind of have their hands busy for most of the encounter. And finally, for Descent, I'm going to give it a -1 for RNG because of augment pickup locations, but that's not super major, so I didn't think it was worth subtracting 2 points for. Finally, that results in Descent getting 8 points, and that's going to put it solidly in the A tier. The last encounter of Deepstone Crypt is, of course, Taniks, and Taniks isn't really done that differently from how Bungie kind of intends the encounter to be done. The only difference in speedrunning is that you start the encounter early with a couple of people not getting flagged, and everybody else gets joining allies, so you have to trap all the ads with only a couple people, which can be kind of a challenge. And then the other thing is that Taniks actually teleports to mid instantly and starts damage if you kill all of the ads quickly after dunking cores that are on the map. So in most LFGs, you're kind of just sitting there waiting for Taniks to start damage as he kind of, you know, shoots you with his blaster while you're sitting outside of his bubble. In the speedruns, that's not the case. As soon as you dunk the cores and all the ads are killed, he starts damage in the middle right away. So that actually reduces the gating factor a little bit. So that being said, Taniks, I'm going to give it a 1 out of 3 for strats because those strats are not particularly complex. You're basically doing LFG 4 core, except everybody has a core they're supposed to shoot with as an Augie's Burden, and you start the encounter with less people and you just do instant damage, which is like, you know, it's not super crazy or anything. I'm also going to give Taniks a 2 out of 3 for gating, and that's because you do have to wait for him to kind of wander over to a side, which can take a little bit of time. If you just went there instantly when all your ad clear was done, I think the encounter would be, you know, a little bit faster, but it's not a big deal. So I'm going to give it a 2 out of 3 for gating. I'm also going to give Taniks a 1 out of 3 for depth, and that's because this encounter is not particularly complex. You have some ad clear that needs to be consistent, and then you have to rocket some ads before damage starts, and then you rocket the boss, and it's, you know, not super complicated in terms of any specific strategic planning. I'm also going to give Taniks a 2 out of 3 for fun factor because half the team is kind of just getting joining allies, killing a captain, and then getting some cores and picking them up, dunking, and then shooting the boss, which is not particularly complicated, not boring, but not super fun either. Finally, I'm going to give Taniks a 0 out of 3 for RNG because in terms of where he moves, as far as I'm aware, it doesn't really affect the time of the encounter whatsoever, and there's not really much RNG besides that. So, Taniks ends with a total score of 6 points, which ranks it in C tier. Next up, we have Vault of Glass. Now, Vault of Glass, unfortunately not a very good speedrunning raid, and you'll find out why pretty soon. Let's start with VoG entrance, which is called Waking Ruins. In Waking Ruins, the strategy is basically to just Shatterline or Strand Skate Strandline to all 3 plates as quickly as possible, and then sit on them for 2 minutes without them being captured. The only thing different besides that is that, you know, in a VoG speedrun, you have some people skip to first encounter and just set up there ahead of time. So that's pretty boring, and the encounter is just 2 minutes of just kind of like sitting there, making sure your plate doesn't get capped, basically AFKing. And so I'm going to give VoG, I'm going to give its entrance a 1 out of 3 for strats because you're only just doing some skips and then lining to a plate and then sitting there. I'm going to give it a 0 out of 3 for gating because there is nothing you can do to speed up this encounter besides getting on the plates quickly. I'm going to give it a 0 out of 3 for depth because there's no depth, you just line to a plate and sit there. I'm going to give it a 0 out of 3 for fun factor because no one is doing anything fun in this encounter. You're lining to a plate and you're sitting there, or you're doing one of the easiest, loosest timing skips in the game and then sitting there. So really boring entrance. I'm going to give it a 0 out of 3 for RNG though because, you know, there's no RNG, so I'm not going to punish it for that. So finally, Vogue Entrance or Waking Ruins ends with a score of 1, which puts it down solidly, beautifully in the F tier. So, after you've trudged your way through the 2 minutes and change that Vogue Entrance is, we have Confluxes. Now, Confluxes is a slight improvement over Entrance because in Confluxes there's a new strategy where you can use a Rocket Sparrow Breach in order to get through the 2 doors that spawn the orange bar harpies above where Templar is during Confluxes, and that speeds up the encounter drastically. However, besides that, there's like a cool strat where you can bait Templar stomping at certain times and that will speed up the encounter. But other than that, this encounter is pretty boring. It's literally just like 4 minutes of ad clear. You know, there's longer encounters in the game, like Vow Entrance, but this is arguably less engaging. So, you know, Confluxes, I'll give it a 2 out of 3 for strats, because, you know, that door breach strat is pretty cool. But, you know, I have to give it a 0 out of 3 for gating, because you're just sitting there clearing ads for so long. And there's certain sections during this encounter that you cannot speed up no matter what you do, as evidenced by some of the analysis of like hard cheated Vogue runs. I'm going to give it a 0 out of 3 for depth as well. I mean, there's not much to this encounter besides the door breaching. You're just killing ads. There's no mechanics to interact with to speak of. I'm going to give it a 1 out of 3 for fun factor because, you know, everybody's technically involved and doing something, but what they're doing is very boring. And finally, I'm going to give it a -1 for RNG. You know, this encounter is not understood super well. Maybe when it is, I'll remove this kind of docking of a point for RNG, but for now it does feel like that this encounter's duration can feel a bit RNG and out of your control, at least with the current strategy. So that's going to leave Confluxes with a total of 2 points, which ranks it again in the F tier with Vogue Entrance. After Entrance, of course, we have the banger encounter, that is Oracles. Oracles, folks, you know, this is more the same. I mean, strategy-wise, there's nothing unique that's used in this encounter. Everybody just on Xeno or some sort of one-shot weapon, and everybody just shoots the Oracle in the order that they appear. Everyone takes one Oracle. There's some rotating and speedrunning, but, you know, that's pretty much just doing the encounter. There's no way to speed up this encounter whatsoever. You can kill the ads, they won't spawn in the oracles faster. You're basically just sitting here. The only thing you can do is just shoot the oracles more optimally, and you can't even shoot them in a very tight sequence because, you know, based on connection, sometimes the text in the bottom left will appear in the correct order and you'll shoot them in the correct order, but if you space them out tightly, you'll actually just get marked anyway. So this encounter is pretty awful. Not much room for optimization besides just shooting quickly. So I'm going to go ahead and give it a 0 for strats. Because it's essentially just doing it how Bungie intended. I'm going to give it a 0 out of 3 for gating because there's such a long amount of time between each wave that you can shoot. You have just ad spawns and the oracles showing themselves twice. It's just so long and tedious. I'm also going to give oracles a 0 out of 3 for depth because, come on, there's not much practice here. You're just shooting oracles, right? It's Simon Says, right? ILFGs can do Simon Says at almost the same level that speedrunners can. So it's really not much. I'm going to give Oracles a 1 out of 3 for fun. You know, everybody's technically participating by shooting one white cube, but come on, you're not doing anything interesting. And finally, I'm going to give Oracles a 0 out of 3 for RNG because the Oracle order doesn't really matter. People just move around and shoot the Oracle that they need to shoot. So that's pretty much it. I'm going to give Oracles a score of 1. We're going to leave it in the F tier and just move on so I don't have to think about this as much. Alright, and now we are on to possibly the only redeemable encounter in Vault of Glass for speedrunning, and that is of course Templar. Now Templar is actually a 4 or 5 second long encounter in a speedrun, and that's because you are picking up a flag, picking up the relic, instantly charging the super, breaking Templar's shield, and then he dies instantly. He just dies on the spot in 3 or 4 seconds with the current strategies. So, you know, because of how short it is, you can't really fault it for anything like gating. So strategy-wise, I'm going to give it a 2 out of 3 because the damage strategy is quite unique. It is the tightest boss kill in all of Destiny 2 raid speedrunning because you have to kill Templar before your skipper gets joining allies from a separate area of the map. So that's pretty cool. I'm going to give it a 2 out of 3. I'm going to give it a 3 out of 3 for gating because you're not really waiting for anything during this encounter. I mean, it's a 4 or 5 second long encounter. Like, what are you waiting for? I'm going to give it a 1 out of 3 for depth because it's just a kill. It's basically just a boss kill. There's not much else to practice. I mean, the damage strategy used is pretty cool. I mean, Sky Parasite, but besides that, it's not much. I'm going to give it a 1 out of 3 for the fun factor because, you know, everybody's doing something, but it's just kind of shooting a boss and then you leave the fire team, right? So not that fun. And finally, I'm going to give it a 0 out of 3 for RNG, and that's because there's no RNG in just, you know, breaking a boss's shield and then instantly nuking it. So Templar gets a total of 7 points, and that's going to put it in the B tier. Okay, next up we have Gatekeepers. Now, Gatekeepers, make no mistake, I think this is the worst encounter in all of raid speedrunning, and possibly all of raids as well. It is really boring. Gatekeepers, strategy-wise, I mean, we do push the Minotaurs off the map, which is not something Bungie intended, I suppose, but, you know, I'm tempted to not even give a point for this, because technically speaking, you could do Gatekeepers at a speedrun level, as in, you know, complete it in the same amount of time as a world record would, without pushing any Minotaurs off the map. You could rotate the relic between portals. We just do it because we're lazy, and, you know, pushing them off the map means having to trade less players around. That's literally the only reason we do it. So 1 out of 3 for strats. I'm going to give it a 0 out of 3 for gating because unlike most encounters in Destiny 2, this encounter has literally only 2 places that matter in terms of the time of the encounter, and that is killing the final Minotaur and Wyvern in both portals as quickly as possible, and that is killing the final 3 Wyverns that spawn at the end of the encounter as quickly as possible. Nothing else in this encounter matters or speeds up the encounter. We have tested, we have tried, there is nothing else that speeds up this encounter, which is really, really awful, which means Gatekeepers is getting a solid 0 in the gating category. It's also getting a 0 out of 3 for depth. There is no practice you need to do in this encounter because half your team is just AFK. You're sitting on a plate or you're sitting there just mindlessly killing ads inside of a portal. It's really not much. Okay, I'm also going to give Gatekeepers a 0 out of 3 for the fun factor because even if everybody is, actually half the team isn't doing anything. So yeah, there's that, and the other half is doing things that are boring. So 0 out of 3, awful. I'm also going to give Gatekeepers a 0 for RNG because there's no RNG in Gatekeepers, but that's not going to redeem it from getting a 1 out of 12 for maximum points, and that's going to put it in the F tier, and we'll leave it at that. Finally, we have Atheon, the boss encounter, the final boss encounter of Vault of Glass, and unfortunately for you, this encounter doesn't have much else redeeming it either. So for strategies, Atheon is basically done the same way that you would do it in an LFG. It's just that you force 3 people to be outside and 3 people to be inside on specialized jobs. I mean, technically you don't have to do this, but we just do this to, you know, have certain people be outside so that they can learn a specific role, and certain people can be inside and they can learn a specific role as well. The only difference between, you know, how Bungie intends that you do Atheon and actual just doing Atheon is just shooting all 3 oracles at the same time. You can shoot all 3 oracles at the same time in this encounter, unlike oracles, and it won't mark you, and it will, you know, clear the wave and continue to the next wave. The only real difference besides that is just damage, right? Damage is a little bit more optimized in Atheon and speedrunning. You kill them pretty fast, like 4 or 5 seconds. But besides that, you know, this counter is really a drag. I mean, I'm gonna give it a 1 out of 3 for strats because the strats are not that different. It's just damage and, you know, simultaneously shooting oracles. I'm going to give it a 0 out of 3 for gating because you spend the first minute of the encounter doing nothing. There is nothing you can do while Atheon is spawning in and walking around doing his little dance and waiting to be teleported. There's nothing you can do there to speed up the encounter. It's really boring. And the amount of time between waves that I criticized oracles for also applies to Atheon. Atheon also, I'm going to give it a 1 out of 3 for depth. I mean, I guess you do need to practice a little bit. It's not like a 0 practice encounter, but it's really not much. I'm going to give it a 0 out of 3 for the fun factor because half the team is literally doing nothing until damage, right? Half the team is literally just damage slaves. So it's really awful. And Atheon is 0 RNG as well. So that's going to leave Atheon with 2 points. That still puts it in the F tier. Man, oh man, VoG is not a great raid for speedrunning. Alright, and next up we have Vow. So Vow is a big change of pace from VoG. Unfortunately, you know, it does have a notoriously bad entrance encounter, and we'll talk about that right now, but as a whole, Vow is a much more enjoyable raid to speedrun. So, what do you do different in Barge, or the payload encounter, compared to how Bungie probably intends you to do it? Well, there are 2 strategies. Number 1, a hunter does the entrance section and gets to the payload as quickly as possible before everyone else does using shatterlining. And number 2, you also have people skip to the first encounter from the Vow entrance and pull you there. Number 3, there's also a new strategy in terms of picking up the knowledge where you can repeatedly respawn knowledge on the first stop and carry over 8 knowledge every single stop, so you only have to dunk 1 knowledge at each stop, and you use the remaining 8 knowledge to carry it to the next stop, so that every time the cart arrives at a stop, it moves very quickly because you only need to dunk 1 knowledge instead of the normal 9, because it carries the 8 over from the previous stop. So, with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and give Barge a 2 out of 3 for points. Strategies, it does have some pretty unique strategies that are more interesting than something like, you know, Atheon or Gatekeepers. I'm going to give it a 0 out of 3 for gating. Now, there are a lot of things you can do to speed up this encounter. However, there's a huge amount of downtime between each cart stop. The cart takes forever to move. It's so slow, and I have to give this encounter, you know, fault for that, and I have to give it a 0. It is such a long amount of downtime that even if some of the encounter can be sped up a substantial amount, the amount of downtime is just unacceptable. I'm going to give it a 1 out of 3 for depth. I mean, you do require a bit of practice, but with good routing, there's not much practice that is needed in this encounter. I'm going to give it a 1 out of 3 for the fun factor because while everybody is involved and while you are doing stuff like, you know, killing the A-bombs, picking up knowledge, that part is fun. The downtime of just sitting on the card for like 30-40 seconds at a time and just doing nothing, that is just, you know, really cuts into the fun factor for every role involved no matter what. Finally, for Vow entrance, I'm going to give it a 0 out of 3 for RNG because, you know, there's no RNG. So that leaves Vow entrance with a 4 out of a possible 12 points, which puts it in the D tier. Alright, so after the Barge makes its way to the end of entrance, everybody gets pulled to Acquisition, and Acquisition is actually one of the better encounters in raid speedrunning in Destiny 2. Now, Strategy-wise, it's actually, I mean, you technically do the encounter sort of normally. I mean, there's nothing like skipping mechanics or anything like that, but the structure, it's much like Descent in terms of structure. It's very, very organized. Certain people go into certain rooms at certain times. Certain people are managing the door crystal. You know, you're pre-aiming on the obelisks. Everybody kind of has a very, very set up structure. It's a very, very network-focused type of encounter in Destiny 2 raid speedrunning, and for that I'm going to go ahead and give it a 3 out of 3 for strats, just because of the coordination as well as the 3 people that leave on 3 different skips at the end of the encounter, something that's rarely ever seen in any Destiny 2 raid speedrun. The only other place where you really have 3 people skip at a time on 3 different sort of routes is possibly Nezarec, which is kind of like a 1-2 split more than a 1-1-1 split. So that being said, I'm going to give, again, Acquisition a 3 out of 3 for strats. I'm going to give it a 2 out of 3 for gating, mostly because at the beginning of the encounter, you're waiting a while for a knight to spawn, as well as at the end of every round, you have a 15-second resonate time that cannot be changed, even if it can feel a little bit tight. If you are, you know, good at your ad clear, you're kind of waiting, 2 or 3, 5 seconds until the next ad starts spawning. There's also the time between knights as well, which can feel kind of long. Outside of that though, I'm going to give Acquisition a 3 out of 3 for depth. Definitely one of the encounters that requires a lot of team practice to get down right. I'm going to give it a 2 out of 3 for the fun factor. There is 1 or 2 roles like mid-defend that is not particularly interesting, and you're kind of just shooting the obelisk, shooting knights, but that's not that bad. And I'm going to go ahead and give Acquisition a 0 for RNG. There is RNG on final round running, but it can be largely eliminated by good pathing and good movement, as well as good strategy. So with that in mind, I'm going to go ahead and give Acquisition a 10 out of 12 for points, and that's going to put it solidly in the A tier. Alright, and after Acquisition, of course, we have Caretaker. Now, Caretaker, normally in LFGs, is a pretty tedious encounter, I would say, because having to 2-floor and 3-floor means that you have to sit through his animations twice as much or 3 times as much and do the same mechanics over and over again, even if the room running is a bit different and the plate distance is a bit different as well. In a speedrunner, however, you have to 1-floor Caretaker, and that makes this encounter a lot more short and a lot more engaging. So, Caretaker, I'm going to give it a 2 out of 3 for strats, just because of the 1-floor, the faster running, as well as the duo final floor, final stand, which is something you're definitely not going to see in a, Bungie-approved strategies, I suppose. And I'm going to give it a 2 out of 3 for gating, because there's not much waiting for this encounter, but you do have to wait 15 seconds after the final input, the ritual is complete for damage to start, and nothing you can do will speed up that segment of the encounter. Now, I'm also going to give Caretaker a 2 out of 3 for depth, because it does require a fair amount of practice to get your symbols very fast, and of course the 1-floor itself, depending on the meta, can be more or less inconsistent. I'm going to go ahead and give Caretaker a 2 out of 3 for fun, because everybody is doing kind of something fun in this encounter. No one's really doing something super boring. I mean, the skip is kind of sitting there for a bit, and the stun rolls are not that interesting, so I took off 1 point, but besides that, everybody's doing something pretty fun. Finally, I'm going to go ahead and give Caretaker a 0 for RNG. Simple RNG can be a little bit annoying, but with good planning, you can plan around it and doesn't negatively affect your run all of the time. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and give Caretaker an 8 out of 12, which ranks it at the bottom of A tier. Next up, we have Exhibition. Now, Exhibition is a banger of a speedrun encounter. Right off the bat, I'm going to let you know that, much like Shuro Chi, I think this encounter is a perfect speedrunning encounter. Why? Well, the strats are incredibly unique. You have early rooms, so you can have one person leave through a hole in different parts of the encounter and go to the next room, and while people are dunking relics in order to open the room, they're killing the ads and early spawning the Gatekeepers. You also have different people on different relics, which allows them to do different jobs more or less optimally. You have holding ads hostage so that you can spawn in next Gatekeepers earlier. You have symbol communication methods. There's a lot of stuff that goes into this encounter, as well as a rejoin strat in which 2 people rejoin the fire team in the middle of the encounter, spawning them in the middle room of the encounter, which is really, really cool. So, strategy-wise, 3 out of 3. I'm also going to give a 3 out of 3 for gating, because there's practically nowhere in this encounter where you're sitting there waiting for something to happen. There's also a 3 out of 3 for depth. This encounter requires a lot of practice between teams to get down consistent. I'm also going to give it a 3 out of 3 on the fun factor, because everybody is moving around doing something in this encounter, whether you're blinking with the laser, whether you're blinking with the taken relic, whether you're, going out on skip and you're going to Rhulk, whether you're calling out symbols, shooting the wall, moving around, killing Gatekeepers. There's all that you were really looking for in a traversal encounter in this encounter. And finally, I'm going to go ahead and give Exhibition a 0 for RNG, because there's pretty much no RNG that negatively affects this encounter to a significant extent, which is going to give Exhibition a total of 12 points, a perfect score in the S tier. As for the final boss of Vow the Disciple, we have, of course, Rhulk. And the Rhulk strategies are not super complicated. I mean, you split a lot more frequently downstairs than you would in like an LFG, and you dunk, you know, 2-2-2 very quickly. But the only unique strat in the encounter besides the skips to get there, which are pretty cool, the only unique strat in the encounter is there's a strategy where you can throw a fusion grenade or some sort of delayed explosion at a glaive, die, and then get res, then you'll have your buff, but this prevents Rhulk from doing an extra dash animation to give you a laser. So that being said, that's a pretty cool and unique strat. And so I'm going to give Rhulk a 2 out of 3, which, you know, lifts it above that barely above LFG standard. That is a 1 out of 3. I'm going to give it a 1 out of 3 for gating, because there are some animations that you can't really speed up, like him going upstairs to his top area or him dashing. You know, those kind of do take some time. I'm going to give Rhulk a 2 out of 3 for depth, because you do need to practice, you know, being in position, getting those symbol callouts right. The rolls can be a little bit confusing, and up top, the damage is definitely something where you kind of need to coordinate different people getting stacks. I'm going to give it a 2 out of 3 for the fun factor, because 1 or 2 people are relegated to kind of just doing callouts or, you know, doing kind of basic rolls during this encounter, but they're not that boring, so I'm only going to dock 1 point. And finally, I'm going to dock an extra point from the RNG, and that's because Rhulk's final stand, its instant final, hasn't really been super figured out yet. If it ever is figured out, I'll probably take this point away and, you know, put it back at 0. But for now, I'm going to give Rhulk a total of 6 points, which puts it in the C tier. The next raid we have on our list is, of course, King's Fall. And King's Fall, you know, it's a pretty iconic raid, but what do I think of it when it comes to speedrunning? Well, it's a really mixed bag, to be honest. Let's start with the Relics encounter, or the entrance encounter, where you pick up balls and you dunk them in the statues in the middle. Well, the Relics encounter, strategy-wise, pretty cool. I mean, you use eager edge swords to right-click, left-click people all around the map. There's some well-lined pickups involved, and just in general, you have the whole team moving around in a coordinated pattern in order to pick up these relics on time and dunk them, you know, around the edge of the map instead of through the taken walls. So I'm going to give that a 2 out of 3. I think that's a fair amount, significantly different strat than, you know, probably what Bungie intended. I'm also going to give it a 3 out of 3 for gating, because there's practically no downtime or waiting in this encounter. You're entirely gated to pickups and movement in this encounter. I'm going to give it a 1 out of 3 for depth, because while you do need to practice a little bit and get your lines down right, once you have that, there's not really much practice or like supreme crazy depth. It's just about not piercing, which I'll discuss when I get to RNG. Fun factor, I think this encounter is very fun. I think everybody's kind of doing an equal job in this encounter. No one has a boring job. Everyone's doing sword skating, you know, maybe doing well-lined pickups, maybe hitting their teammates, whatever it is. Everybody's doing something, and that something is pretty fun for the entirety of the encounter. I'm also going to give Relics a -2, the maximum score deduction from RNG. And the reason for that is, Relics, this encounter has the highest proportion of the team, highest percentage of the team hitting the highest percentage of the team in any D2 raid encounter. In stuff like Queenswalk, you have a limited subset of people hitting maybe a specific person, right? Whereas in King's Fall, you have almost everybody on the team hitting someone, and they're hitting different people. And because of that, you are guaranteed to have some sort of connection interference where one person will pierce someone else. And unfortunately, in this entrance encounter, having even one pierce can mean that you restart the raid if you're going for a really good time. And this becomes really demotivating, because it is really something that you largely can, you know, fend off, but it's not something you can fully control. So it's really, really annoying. Makes King's Fall entrance. I say this a lot. I would rather run, you know, 1 Vow entrance than 3 King's Fall entrances. So, because Vow entrance is consistent. So yeah, that's it. I'm going to give King's Fall Relics a total of 7 points, which is going to put it in the B tier. After we go flying through the tomb ship section, we have, of course, the first real encounter of King's Fall, which is Totems. Now, Totems, you might expect, is a pretty boring encounter in speedrunning, but in fact, it's the complete opposite. In LFG, you're kind of just sitting there doing ad clear, repeatedly cycling the brand between 3 people, but in speedrunning, you kind of have a high octane encounter because of how the strategy is designed. This is one of the most unique strategies seen in speedrunning, and it's called the double solo strategy. So what you actually do is you have the solo strategy from trio totems. If you've done a low man of King's Fall before, you have both sides have one player enter and exit the totem rooms on left and right repeatedly, refreshing their poison stacks inside of the brands. Now, where are the brands, you might ask? Well, the brands are not even inside the room ever. They are actually situated on the middle plate, and that way they can get kills while dunking those stacks into the plate as quickly as possible. Because if you didn't know, this encounter actually spawns more adds the more stacks you dunk. And so having people dunk stacks and get even more adds, which gets them more stacks into this perpetual cycle of stack dunking, is the most productive way of doing the encounter. So you actually have 2 people with brands on the plate, and you're 2-manning with the brand knights that are on the upper ledges, while the people on the outer extremities of the encounter sitting on the totems reset the totems so that you never wipe. So that was a really long explanation, but 3 out of 3 for Totem strategy. I'm also going to give it a 3 out of 3 for gating because you're practically entirely ad gated. It's about your performance. I'm going to give it a 3 out of 3 for depth because you do need to practice this encounter a fair amount to get it down right. And I'm going to give it a 2 out of 3 for fun, mostly because there are 1 or 2 roles that are, fake skating in and out of the right rooms, the solo roles that have relatively low pressure and, low intensity roles that are not super fun because you're kind of doing a repetitive process. So with that being said, I'm going to give Totems also a 0 for RNG because obviously there's not really RNG, it's just based on how fast you clear the ads. So Totems is going to get a total of 11 points, which is going to put it in the S tier. Right after Totems, we have, of course, Warpriest, the first boss encounter of King's Fall. Now, Warpriest, you might think there's some cool, crazy strat that allows you to, skip a brand or like early brand or something like that, but no, there's no such strat. This encounter is actually done entirely normally. So I have to give it a 0 out of 3 for strats. The only difference is that you're going to 1 night instead of maybe 1 phasing or 2 phasing like you would in an LFG. You're just going for a solid 1 night. After the Pack Hunter nerf, 0 nighting is almost impossible. If quick swapping doesn't get patched, maybe it'll be possible next season, but for now, you're really just focusing on, 1 nighting and exchanging the brand just once. So besides that, everyone's just basically picking a door and clearing the ads from that door. And that's practically all there is to it. So 0 out of 3 for strats. I'm going to give it a 2 out of 3 for gating because you are waiting a little bit during the brand section. And there are times where you're sitting just waiting at your door for ads to spawn because you're gated to the encounter spawning the ads. So kind of boring. I'm also going to give Warpriest a 0 out of 3 for depth. There's almost no practice needed for this encounter besides just doing DPS. I'm going to give it a 1 out of 3 for the fun factor because everybody is doing something in this encounter, but that thing is watching an ad door and just waveframing it repeatedly, and then doing damage to a very vanilla-esque boss. So very, very simple. And finally, I'm going to give it a 0 for RNG because Warpriest RNG is not very significant. I mean, he could be right on top of your well, which can be annoying. You could get left first brand, which is kind of annoying. But besides that, really not much to look at here. So with that being said, I'm going to give Warpriest 3 points, which is going to place it in the D tier, one of the most vanilla bosses that you could possibly imagine in Destiny 2. Next up, we have Golgoroth. Now, Golgoroth is a slight improvement over Warpriest, and that's mostly because the damage strategy in Golgoroth is a lot more involved. It's not just your typical Izzy Rocket rotation, which is like super brain dead to do. And of course, Golgoroth has the gaze mechanic, which forces you to rethink which players do which roles. Now, that being said, Golgoroth's downside is that, even in a speedrun, no matter how quickly you clear the ads, it's very lenient in terms of which ads you need to kill, and it's also, just very, very boring. There's just 4 doors, and you just kind of repeatedly kill the ads coming from those doors. Not very interesting. So yeah, not a very dynamic encounter. I'm going to give it a 1 out of 3 for strategies because you're basically doing the encounter normally, except the damage is more optimized, like a lot more optimized. You 2 bubble instead of maybe 6 bubbling like you would in an LFG. I'm going to go ahead and give Golgoroth a 2 out of 3 for gating because no matter how fast you clear the ads, it does seem like you're waiting a long time in order to get that bubble to spawn in, and it doesn't seem like you can change much about that. I'm going to give it a 1 out of 3 for depth because the encounter is not very deep. I mean, you do need to practice gaze transfer and trading and doing damage correctly, so it's a little bit more deep than something like Warpriest, but still not really up there. And finally, I'm going to give Golgoroth a 2 out of 3 for the fun factor because everybody is sort of involved and the damage is interesting for most players, I would say almost all the players involved. So the damage is really what sells this encounter, and Golgoroth has practically 0 RNG, so no penalties there. So Golgoroth is getting a total of 6 points, which is a marked improvement over the 3 we give to Warpriest, and that's going to put it in the C tier. Now, Daughters is the next encounter of King's Fall, and you might think it's, kind of boring. You just have to do the same mechanics twice in a row, and they do involve all 6 players, but they're not particularly interesting. Well, in a speedrun, you actually only have to do the mechanics once, and that's because there's a strategy using a Titan Super Desync that actually allows you to dunk on both Daughters. And there's also another strategy that's used in speedrunning, and because you know you're only going to do 1 round, you force certain players to be torn, and you have them well bounce up using well lining and a slanted ledge near the Daughters in order to fly up to where the brand claimer is ahead of time. So this is really, really unique, a combination of cool movement strategies as well as a, kind of game exploit, which is really, really unique. You don't really see that in D2 speedrunning too often. So I'm going to give Daughters a 3 out of 3 for strategy for being very, very unique. I'm going to give it a 3 out of 3 for gating because you're not really waiting for much. I'm going to give it a 3 out of 3 for depth because you do need to practice this encounter a fair amount for the players that are doing the important roles. But I'm going to give it a 1 out of 3 for fun. So why would I give it a 1 out of 3 for fun? Well, that's because there are certain players in this encounter that basically stay dead for the first half of the encounter, and then for the second half, they're just there for the damage. So, it's kind of like a Crypt Security type situation where it's really, not that fun for half the team, but very, very fun for the other half. In fact, I would say a lot more fun than Crypt Security. Now, I'm going to give Daughters a 0 out of 3 for RNG because even no matter where the brand claimers are, it doesn't really matter if your strategy is designed correctly. So, point-wise, that's going to give a 10 to Daughters, a 10 out of 12, and that's going to give Daughters an A tier, solid A tier encounter. I wasn't lying when I said King's Fall was a bit of a mixed bag. So far, we've had a B tier encounter, an S tier encounter, a D tier encounter, and a C tier encounter, and an A tier encounter. That's what? S, A, B, C, D. And finally, Oryx is going to be in the F tier, not to give any spoilers away. So why is Oryx in the F tier? Well, Oryx in speedrunning is done basically the exact same as it is in an LFG or as Bungie intended. The only difference is that you get into your bombs earlier. You don't get in on text, you get in when he starts to raise his hand, which is the actual time when you can get in. And you pick up the third brand claimer piece, the final brand claimer piece, the actual claimer itself, using heat rises, right? So you force a certain person to pick that up. That being said, you know, that's basically it. It's not particularly interesting how this encounter works. I'm going to give it a 1 out of 3 for strategies because like I mentioned, there's not that much difference. I'm going to give it a 1 out of 3 for gating because Oryx has some really painfully long cutscenes, like Atheon-esque cutscenes where at the start of the encounter, he's just taking his sweet time to come down and slam on a plate. And he's also taking his sweet time to go to final stand, which is, you know, really long. Depth-wise, I'm going to give it a 1 out of 3 because you do need to practice this encounter like a fair amount to get the plate timings right and, you know, the floater system. But it's not super complicated or anything like that. I'm going to give it a 1 out of 3 for fun as well because everybody's doing something, but nobody's doing something particularly interesting. And finally, I'm going to give it a -2 for RNG. So you might be wondering, why is Oryx a -2? Well, if you haven't noticed and you haven't done this raid a lot, Oryx, if he goes to a bottom plate, takes an extra, like, you know, 5 to 10 seconds of your time. And there's nothing you can do. You cannot control what plate he goes to, whatever. So... And the fact that this encounter is at the end of a raid means that you could be on pace for a really, really good run and then have it ruined because Oryx just decides to take a bottom plate instead of a top plate. So he takes longer to get down there, he takes longer to get the final stand, and that can really just ruin a run, and it's at the end of the raid. So I'm going to give it a -2. That's going to result in Oryx ending with a total of 2 points, which is going to put it in the F tier. 6 raids down, and that leaves 2 to go. Of course, we're talking about Root of Nightmares next. Now, Root of Nightmares has 4 solid encounters, in my opinion, either the best or the second best speedrunning raid, and I'll explain just why. So, Root of Nightmares starts off with Cataclysm. Cataclysm is a bit of a banger. The strategy-wise, you know, you're not going to see something that's super different from what you do in LFG. It's not like you're skipping like nodes or anything, or you're doing anything crazy like that, but you're basically doing a vastly improved strategy version of what is normally done in like an LFG. So in an LFG, you might have 1 person or 2 people running that understand the node patterns very well. In a properly executed speedrun, you have all 5 players with 1 on skip. You have all 5 players who are all executing the nodes perfectly. It's very, very beautiful to watch. Great for speedrunning. And this kind of ability to delegate roles very equally and specifically is what is really this raid's greatest strength when it comes to speedrunning. However, because the strategies are relatively similar to what you would see in an LFG, I'm still forced to give this thing a 2 out of 3 for strats. There is one unique strategy that pulls it over like a 1 out of 3, and that is the fact that you can carry buff from previous sections to the next sections, and the emphasis on ad clear, which you typically don't see in an LFG, because that ad clear actually matters to speeding up the next node section. So I'm going to give it a 2 out of 3 for strats. I'm going to give it a 3 out of 3 for gating, because there's really not much waiting in this encounter. I'm going to give it a 3 out of 3 for depth, because you really need to practice a very well-planned strategy to get this encounter down consistent. I'm going to give it a 3 out of 3 for the fun factor, and that's because everybody is involved in this encounter except the skipper, who is, I guess the skip is pretty boring, but besides that, everybody's pretty much involved in this encounter equally. And finally, for RNG, if you plan the strategy correctly, there's no RNG in this encounter, which I'm going to give a 0 for, which means Cataclysm gets a solid 11 out of 12 points, which puts it solidly in the S tier. Next up, we almost have kind of like a sibling encounter to Cataclysm, which is of course Scission. Now, Scission is a little bit different from Cataclysm. There's 2 different node colors, and you have a skipper that pulls everyone there, and there's floors. Now, the main difference between Scission and Cataclysm is that Scission has, again, 2 node colors, but there's no RNG. And because there's no RNG, the shift focus drastically from reacting and pathing and networking these nodes correctly to actually doing ad clear. Because you know where the nodes are all the time. You don't really need to think about that. You just need to go to the node that you know is going to be there and shoot it on time. The main issue is that to actually end a floor and to summon the interlopers and, you know, have energy travel upwards, you need to clear all of the ads on a floor. And that can be a very meticulous job when there is ads leaping from the back sections of a floor that you maybe haven't seen. And if you haven't planned everything out correctly, you're going to end up losing time to having to clear ads. So this is very, very important. And it's kind of why this encounter can have a high skill ceiling in a speedrunning setting. So I'm going to give it a 2 out of 3 for strats because besides early flooring, like jumping to another floor early to start it before your teammates get there and the lifts activate is a strategy that exists, but it's not super complicated, so no 3 out of 3. I'm going to give Scission a 3 out of 3 for gating though. You're practically never waiting for anything. I'm going to give it a 3 out of 3 for depth. Teams need a lot of practice to get this encounter done right. And I'm going to give it a 3 out of 3 for fun because, you know, what's more fun than well lining across floors and clearing ads with sunbracers and, you know, wave frames and just sword skating everywhere with your teammates and everyone's just flying around all the place. You know, it's a great speedrunning encounter. I'm going to give it a 3 out of 3 for the fun factor. And finally, I'm going to give it a 0 out of 3 for RNG because, like I said, there's no RNG in this encounter. So that's going to be an 11 out of 12 for our wonderful Scission friend, and that's going to leave it in the S tier. The first boss encounter of Root of Nightmares is, of course, Explicator. Now, Explicator, unfortunately, is not a very engaging encounter when it comes to speedrunning. Strat-wise, it's a 1 out of 3. It's not very different from what Bungie intended. You're kind of just, you know, using swords to get across the chasm quickly and dunk planets quickly. But besides that, you're not really doing much else that's special. I mean, you're making finishers to compensate for the fact that you started on swords and not rockets, but that's not particularly complicated either. And damage-wise, you're just killing him more optimally than you would in like an LFG. So I'm going to give Explicator a 1 out of 3 for being barely above LFGs and or like barely above the Bungie intended way. I'm going to give it a 2 out of 3 for gating because you do have to wait through his final stand animation as well as his getting to damage animation, which are a bit slow. I'm going to give it a 1 out of 3 for depth because there's really not that much practice needed for this encounter, to be honest with you. And I'm going to give it a 2 out of 3 for fun because, you know, a lot of people are doing important roles, you know, whether you're clearing ads in mid to spawn in the Colossi, whether you're killing the Colossi and lining across, you know, there's a fair amount of roles here that are relatively fun and, you know, it's a medium paced encounter. It's not super boring. And yeah, I'm going to give it a 0 for RNG as well. And so that's going to result in 6 total points for Explicator, which is going to place it in the C tier. And of course, after Explicator, we have the final encounter of Root of Nightmares and Nezarec. Now, I would be doing a disservice to not mention the fact that Nezarec has a very unique skip structure from Explicator to Nezarec. And the way that this works is you have one person skip from Explicator to Nezarec right as the encounter ends so that they can get there and open his cocoon as early as possible. But you have 2 other people who also get there to place a flag and get ready to do the mechanics of the encounter during the puzzle section, because while his cocoon is opening and his animation is playing out, people can still arrive at the encounter without dying to something like turn back or getting joining allies. So this is a really cool implement, not something you see in most speedruns, people leaving at different times. The only other speedrun you see it in is, it's really VOW, I would say. So, or like DSC, like Airlock. But besides that, you know, pretty cool stuff. Nezarec, I'm going to give it a 1 out of 3 for strats though, unfortunately, because besides that, there aren't really any unique strats used in this encounter. So that's really all I can give it credit for. I'm also going to give it a 3 out of 3 for gating because you're only gated to mechanics here and those are all player controlled. I'm going to give it a 1 out of 3 for depth because there's not much practice that goes into this encounter. It's basically just do the nodes and then shoot the boss and, you know, clear some ads and then shoot the boss. And then finally, we have the fun factor. Fun factor is pretty high. I would say 2 out of 3 because most people are involved in this encounter. You're just doing nodes and then doing damage. The other people are kind of like doing finishers and getting us aggro, but, you know, it's not a particularly interesting role, so I docked a point. Finally, there's no RNG in Nezarec, so pretty consistent encounter in terms of speedrunning. So I'm going to give it a 7 out of 12 of total points, and that's going to land Nezarec in the B tier. Okay, next up we have Crota's End, which is the most recently released raid. First up in Crota's End, we have Hellmouth. So Hellmouth is the entrance encounter. You basically just pick up a chalice and enlighten a plate, and then once you enlighten a plate, people who have skipped to the Abyss encounter can pull the people from entrance once they hit a certain checkpoint. Now, the only things really unique about this encounter compared to like bare bones is the fact that 4 people skip at the start of the encounter to get to Abyss and start it early, and you can hit a checkpoint at the end of the bridge when it's fully built early, so that you can be pulled to Abyss before the bridge is fully formed. Now, that being said, that's not particularly that interesting, so I'm going to give Hellmouth a 1 out of 3 for strategies. I'm going to give it a 1 out of 3 for gating because it has the lowest number of ads of any chalice-based encounter, which means that you're going to be sitting there for a long time just kind of clearing ads no matter what, no matter how quickly you clear those ads. So it does feel like a long wait. I'm also going to give Hellmouth a 0 out of 3 for depth because there's almost no practice needed for this encounter. It's like VOG entrance, you just sit on a plate and clear ads. I'm going to give it a 0 out of 3 for fun factor because it's not particularly fun for anyone involved. There's 4 people at first encounter that are sitting there for like 40 seconds, so pretty boring for them as well. And I'm going to give it a 0 for RNG because there's not really any RNG in this encounter, which leaves Hellmouth with a 2 out of 12, so that's a solid F tier. Next up, we have Abyss. Now, Abyss, you might think is a very slow-paced, boring encounter. There's a lot of slow walking, trudging through the trenches, the darkness, with people dying from behind, falling behind. You know, where's the preserve location? In speedrunning, on the other hand, all of these long walking dark sections are actually bypassed using movement tech, such as Luminate grappling, Tangle grappling, and well skating. And all of this is made possible by an intelligent combination of scouting and communication and pre-tangle making. So all of this is really sped up and optimized in a speedrun. The only downside here is the fact that certain preserve sequences are such long distances away or create such awkward movement that there's a rather significant RNG component to this encounter. So as a result, I gave Abyss a 3 out of 3 for strats, very unique. I gave it a 2 out of 3 for gating because at the end there is a significant amount of time before that bridge builds, no matter how fast your ad clear is. I gave it a 3 out of 3 for depth. It does require a fair amount of practice for teams, but if you do practice and have very good routing, you'll see very great results. I'm going to give it a 3 out of 3 for the fun factor because, you know, everybody is involved. Everybody is, you know, no one's job is like super loose, super boring. And I give Abyss a -2 for RNG. This encounter is really rough. You can lose 10-15 seconds on any bad preserve sequence. Some sequences are so bad that teams will just choose to see them and immediately restart the raid and just not run them. So the RNG can be pretty rough. I'm going to give it a total of 9 points, and that's going to give Abyss an A tier placement. Next up, we have Bridge. Now, Bridge, hate it or love it, it is a very complex encounter, one of the most complex when it comes to strategy and player routing. Now, I'm not going to go into the amount of strategy development that has happened recently about Bridge leading up to the Crota's End speedrun tourney, but just know that there are some very unique strategies, including Drain, Pity mechanics, where you can sort of semi-dupe a sword. There's Radiant buff stacking. You have some very efficient player distribution, lots of stuff, you know, solo plating, solo building, just really crazy and cool strats that I'd like to highlight. So I will highlight them in a future video like I mentioned with Garden, when I make my raid kind of a speedrunner, inside a speedrunner's mind type videos. But for now, Bridge, I'm going to give the strats a 3 out of 3, very complex, very dense. I'm going to give gating a 2 out of 3 because at the start of the encounter, you can't really speed up that, you know, that bridge building too much. You know, you can speed it up a lot, but it's still kind of waiting there doing just ad clear for a while before the encounter really kicks up into full gear. I'm going to say the depth is a 3 out of 3. You have to practice this encounter a lot to get it consistent, but once you do get it consistent, it's a very good feeling. And I'm going to give it a 3 out of 3 for the fun factor because everybody's involved at almost every stage of this encounter, and all the jobs, although they are ad clear based for the most part, there's a lot of stuff that you need to do to get this encounter right. So, and finally, yeah, RNG, I'm going to say a 0. Some strategies, if designed inadequately, can result in dealing with some RNG, but besides that, you know, if you do this strategy correctly for this encounter, it's very fast and has a very little RNG involved. So that being said, Bridge is going to get a total of 11 points, which puts it solidly in the S tier. The third encounter of Crota's End, we have, of course, Iriute. Now, Iriute, in terms of a boss encounter, is not too bad, right? I mean, the strategies-wise, you know, you actually never interact with the Chalice in speedrunning. You have 3 Warlocks on Winter's Wrath and Ballador's Wrathweavers, which allows them to shoot their stasis projectiles through the walls in the Iriute encounter, freeze those wizards, and then right-click to shockwave them through the wall, instantly killing them. Now, that being said, this strategy is good, but can be kind of annoying because if you ever get, for example, 2 wizards in the right tower, or, you know, 3 wizards in the spawn towers, that can be a big problem because one warlock has to take care of all of those wizards by themselves, especially for the bottom right wizard because she can be very annoying and decide not to come out to see you, and it can be very difficult to freeze her. So that being said, Iriute, I'm going to give it a 2 out of 3 for the unique strat. You bypass the main mechanic of the raid encounter, but it's not super intricate or planned out like something like Bridge is in the same raid. I'm going to give Iriute a 3 out of 3 for gating because gating wise, you're not really waiting for anything besides just ad clear, which it's pretty rapid, the rate at which ads spawn. I'm going to give it a 2 out of 3 for depth because in terms of practice, you do need to practice this encounter and be able to react to where the wizards are spawning, but the actual strategy and the execution is not super complicated and you'll get it down relatively quickly. I'm also going to give Iriute a 2 out of 3 for the fun factor, and that's because most people in this encounter are doing something relatively interesting, you know, whether it is the Winter's Wrath person or just shooting ass with Kalli, but I would not say it's about as equally distributed as something like Bridge or Shuro Chi. Finally, I'm going to give Iriute a -2 for RNG. If you ever get double right, it's basically a guaranteed restart because of just how slow and annoying bottom right freezing is. If you get 3 mids, it's really annoying. You know, you have to kind of run for 1-1-1 RNG and hopefully not get bottom right. and that can be kind of annoying. If the strategy is ever amended to make up for this difference, maybe we'll reduce some of the points that were docked for RNG, but for now, Iryut gets a total of 7 points, which puts it solidly in the B tier. Moving on to the final encounter of our most recently released raid in D2, Crota's End, and that is of course Crota. Now, Crota is not particularly interesting in speedrunning, unfortunately, even as a final boss encounter. Now, there's two things that are done differently in speedrunning compared to normal LFG or Bungie approved techniques, and that is number one, you one sword the boss by using Radiant, Lumina, and Tractor stacking, and number two is you sword out of the starting chamber of Crota out of that green wall early in order to hit some checkpoints that spawn in the Boomer Knights, which then subsequently spawn in the Swordbearer and the Ogres early. Now, neither of these things is particularly complex and particularly unique, creative, inspirational, or innovative, so I'm not going to give Crota more than a 1 out of 3 for strategy. It's bordering on a 2, but I really decided to give it a 1. I'm also going to give Crota's End Crota a 2 out of 3 for gating, because you are kind of waiting for the chalice to fill up no matter how quickly you spawn in the ads, and the chalice does not spawn in until Crota's long cutscene is over. So, you know, that cutscene alone just kind of cuts a point from gating. I'm also going to give Crota a 1 out of 3 for depth, because while it is a cool encounter and it's not like super boring, it's also not particularly deep or difficult to practice. And finally, for fun factor, I'm going to give it a 1 out of 3. No one is doing a particularly super interesting role during this encounter. It's basically just clear ads when the chalice person says so, and then kill the boss. And yeah, and then for RNG, I'm going to give Crota a 0 because there's not really RNG that affects Crota. Sure, he can be a bit annoying and, you know, dodge some of your Swordbearer's attacks, or, you know, he can be kind of weird with his movement, but besides that, it's not really major RNG that I would call like Oryx level run ending RNG. And so I'm going to give Crota a 0 for RNG, which gives it a total of 5 points, leaving our final entry in the tier list at a solid D. If you're curious about how each and every raid stacks up against each other in terms of average scoring, well, I'll tell you this much, it's in the spreadsheet linked in the description, and it goes something like this. Garden, Vow, and Ron are the 3 best raids to speedrun on an encounter basis, with Last Wish, Deepstone Crypt, Kingsfall, and Crota's End tied up for 4th place, and of course Vault of Glass at the bottom of the barrel by a long shot. Now, that being said, this obviously is just an average of the encounters themselves, doesn't account as much for stuff like skips and transitions, but I accounted for it a little bit if the encounter is significantly affected by the lack or presence of a player because of a skip. Now, with that being said, that is it. All 41 raid encounters ranked from Kalli all the way down to Crota from S to F tier. I hope you guys enjoyed that video and gave you a little bit of insight as to what speedrunners like in an encounter. I'm sure some of the encounters in the S and A tiers are encounters that the community loves and enjoys for other reasons, maybe aesthetic or personal preference, but some of them may have surprised you. Maybe some of the encounters in the F tier are encounters that you actually do enjoy doing if you raid at a different sort of context from speedrunning. So with that in mind, I hope you guys enjoyed. We're going to be moving to, I think, primary tier lists pretty soon, and then I'm going to be largely done with tier lists at that point in time. We'll revisit them next season. I'll of course update these whenever new raid encounters come out. If you're interested, I might do like dungeon tier lists or something like that with the same format. But yeah, I hope this was entertaining, and I'll see you guys in the next video.